The tree that started this whole mess was already dead the day I finally admitted it to myself. Its bark flaked like old paint, branches snapped off in light wind, and the trunk had that gray, hollow look that makes you step a little wider when you walk past. Wind off the bay hissed through the palms along our entrance road, but the old oak in my front setback just creaked in a way that did not sound alive. Most people would see a hazard. My homeowners association saw a decoration. They called it part of the signature entrance canopy, like it was some priceless art piece instead of a rotting log leaning toward the sidewalk where kids rode scooters and retirees walked tiny dogs. I did not know yet that this argument over one dead tree would turn into a full-blown HOA nightmare with threats of a $5,000 lien and lectures about visual harmony. I also did not know that a shaky video file on my phone and a series of boring-looking documents would become the sharpest tools I had. What I did know was simple: if that trunk decided to give up in the middle of a coastal storm, it was going to fall somewhere people actually used. The board's obsession with their postcard perfect entrance had turned my property line into a fault line. The more they tried to protect their image, the more obvious it became that they were willing to gamble with everyone else's safety to do it. From the street, it still looked pretty enough if you were driving fast and not paying attention. That was what they cared about. You could almost feel it, the pressure to act like everything was fine, to leave the dead thing standing and pretend decay was just a seasonal phase. I kept thinking that if anything happened, they would swear it was my fault for not pushing back harder. So when the first letter from the association showed up, with a logo that tried too hard to look official and the tone of a disappointed teacher, I knew I had stepped into something bigger than a simple yard problem. I just wasn't sure how deep the roots went yet. Our community wraps around a bend in the coast, a neat loop of stucco houses and manicured lawns feeding into one main entrance road. The late afternoon sun bounced off the white walls of the gatehouse and the matching row of oaks lining the drive, like a staged photo in a real estate brochure. That row is the board's pride and joy. There are rules for everything, but the trees at the entrance have their own special section in the covenants. The association calls it that streetscape. In their brochures, it is evidence of commitment to beauty and consistency. In their internal emails, which I would later see, it is described less politely as the brand. They cared about those trees the way some people care about family heirlooms. The weird part is where the responsibility falls. The land under my dead tree is this tiny strip that is technically HOA common area but effectively welded to my front yard. I mow it. I edge it. I rake the leaves. Yet the association claims exclusive control over removal and replacement for entrance trees. That arrangement works fine until the tree in front of your house dies and you are told to pretend it is fine. The tree started declining a couple of years back. After a rough hurricane season, it stopped leafing out on one whole side. Limbs shriveled, bark cracked along the base, and mushrooms started appearing near the roots. I mentioned it once, casually, to a board member at the annual meeting, and got a vague reminder about submitting any requests through proper channels. That was my first real look at how this board worked. The president, Mr. K, is a retired engineer who treats our governing documents like they are blueprints for a bridge. He believes in symmetry above all. The treasurer, Ms. L, is quiet until money is brought up, then suddenly remembers every line of the fine schedule. But the real gatekeeper, at least for landscaping, is Ms. D, the self-appointed landscape chair who lives in one of the houses closest to the entrance. She is the kind of person who notices if the seasonal flowers are rotated a day late. They send newsletters about the most trivial things. Once, we got a whole page about how mismatched mulch shades were disrupting the visual cohesion of the entrance corridor. Another time, they reminded everyone that garden flags had to be subdued in color. You could feel the pettiness in the way they wrote, like they were offended by anything that wasn't part of their perfect little model street. When my tree got worse, it went from slightly sad to painfully obvious. A big limb overhanging the sidewalk dropped without any storm at all, just a regular windy day. I cleaned up the mess, dragged the pieces to the side, and sent in a maintenance request through the association's portal, attaching photos. I explained that the tree looked dead or dying, that branches were falling, and that it might be time to consider removal and replacement. Weeks passed. No reply. The only thing that showed up was the quarterly newsletter, with a cheery little reminder about keeping entry trees pruned and presentable. I started to realize that to them, presentable meant green, symmetrical, and upright in a photo, not structurally sound in real life. Then, one morning, I opened my mailbox and saw a window envelope with the association's logo again. Inside was not the response I expected. It was a landscape maintenance citation dated March 3, 2024. According to them, I had committed an unauthorized alteration to entrance vegetation because I had removed significant limb matter without approval. In plain language, they were upset that I picked up the large broken branches and trimmed dangling stubs so they would not fall on anyone. There was a warning at the bottom about possible fines if I did any further alterations without going through their architecture process. It was absurd. I had cleaned up a safety hazard, and now they were threatening penalties for it. The citation became the first piece of paper in what would become my growing folder of evidence. I set the letter next to a pile of broken wood on my porch table. The branches were dry and crumbly, the leaves on them completely brown. If you tapped them against the ground, they snapped like chalk. That was what they considered vegetation worth protecting. I tried to do things their way. I filled out the architectural request form, like they said. I listed removal of dead tree at entrance strip and replacement with same species, approved nursery stock. I attached new pictures, dated clearly at the bottom. I even printed a copy of the landscape maintenance citation and clipped it to the back, hoping it would remind them of the danger they were pretending not to see. Their rules said they had 30 days to respond. That felt like forever when you watched a dead trunk lean closer and closer over a sidewalk. But I waited. I followed their process. I wanted a record that I had tried to work with them. 30 days came and went. In the damp air after a passing shower, the tree smelled faintly of rot when I walked past. Every time a storm warning appeared on the weather report, my stomach tightened a little. This wasn't just a cosmetic issue anymore, it was a risk that came with a countdown. The first actual storm of the season wasn't even that bad by coastal standards. The kind of system that brings steady wind, sharp gusts, and sheets of sideways rain, but not the deep fear of a named hurricane. The soil around the roots turned dark and soggy. The whole tree moved. It did not sway like a healthy tree, it lurched. I stood in my front window and watched the base heave as wind pushed the crown. The trunk tilted in a way that made no sense for something that was supposed to be anchored in the ground. It looked like an old tooth that had finally loosened. I grabbed my phone and recorded. I recorded the way the bark cracked near the base as it flexed. I recorded the way the soil on the sidewalk side lifted with each gust. I recorded a small branch snapping off and dropping into the grass just a few feet from the pavement. There were no kids there, no one got hurt, but it was clear that if you happened to be walking by at the wrong moment, that falling piece could have hit you. I did not narrate or shout in the video. I said almost nothing at all. I let the sounds of the wind and the groan of the tree tell the story. Later, when I watched it back, I realized that the quiet made it even more unsettling. Right after the storm passed, I called a certified arborist. Again, no drama, no threats. I just described what I was seeing and asked if he could come look at it. He showed up in a pickup truck with his company logo on the side, took one look at the trunk, and shook his head. I could tell by his face that this was not going to be a wait-and-see situation. I walked the property line with him and let him do his job. He tapped the trunk, examined the root flare, and used a handheld tool to test the density of the wood. He pointed out fungal growth at the base that I had ignored as just yard mushrooms. He explained that the tree had significant internal decay and that the lean over the sidewalk created a clear target area if it failed. He did not mince words. In his written report, which I requested, he classified the tree as a high-priority removal due to advanced structural compromise and public use below. That written report became the second item in my growing evidence stack. It came on company letterhead, dated, with photos embedded, and clear language about the risk. It also included a quote for removal and stump grinding, which was not cheap but still far less than what a single lawsuit could cost if the thing actually fell on someone or something. Armed with that report, I updated my architectural request file. I sent a new packet to the association, arborist report, video clip, and a short explanation of why I believed removal was necessary. I reminded them gently of the 30-day rule in our covenants and asked for a prompt response given the upcoming storm season. I thought that would be enough to snap them into reality. I was wrong. The board's response finally arrived as another envelope with that same logo and the same stiff layout. Inside was a denial. They claimed the arborist's findings were inconclusive because the tree still carried seasonal canopy on certain branches. That was their phrase for a few scraggly clusters of leaves near the top that had not yet given up. They cited CCR Section 7.4 Streetscape Integrity as the basis for the denial, saying that entrance trees may not be removed without a supermajority board vote unless deemed an imminent hazard by the association's own vendor. In other words, my expert did not count because he was my expert. Only their chosen landscape contractor could declare the tree dangerous enough to remove. That was when the pattern started to show. They weren't just stubborn. They had built a system that protected their vision of the entrance more than it protected their homeowners. The denial letter mentioned fines if I attempted removal without proper authorization. There was a schedule in the back of the covenants showing daily penalties for unapproved changes. It was the first time I actually sat down and did the math. If they decided to go after me, the numbers could add up quickly. This wasn't just about a tree anymore, it was about how much power they believed they had to punish me for not playing along. Storm season was starting in a couple of months. Insurance renewal was coming up. The idea that a dead tree could fall and somehow be pinned on me for ignoring covenants started to feel less like paranoia and more like a very real scenario. I could see where this was going if I did nothing. I stood under that tree one more time, looking up at the brittle branches and the way the trunk leaned toward the sidewalk. I thought about the line in the arborist's report that called removal strongly recommended before peak storm activity. That was not the kind of phrase you wanted to ignore and then explain later to an insurance adjuster. There was a deadline forming in my mind, one that had nothing to do with their 30-day rule. It was the date of the first named storm forecast to brush our coastline that year. If the association was going to use process to stall me, I was going to use time to pressure them. I knew that calendar would matter later, when people looked back at what everyone knew and when they knew it. I did not know yet how ugly their response would get when I pushed. I only knew this: the board was treating a rotting trunk like a decorative prop, and the clock on hurricane season was ticking whether they cared or not. The association treated hurricanes like distant rumors until they needed them as an excuse in a newsletter. I watched that dead trunk haul itself back and forth in the wind and realized we lived on opposite sides of reality. For them, the tree was a backdrop for their perfect entrance road. For me, it was a slow-moving hazard with my name on the insurance policy. I knew I could not just wait for their approval while the trunk dissolved from the inside out. But I also knew they were the kind of board that loved to punish anyone who stepped an inch out of line. If I moved too fast, they would call it defiance. If I moved too slow, they would call it negligence. The trick was to make them pick a side and then live with it. So I started with one small step. I wrapped a line of bright hazard tape around the base of the tree and out toward the sidewalk, forming a loose triangle. It was not pretty, but it was clear. Someone had noticed this was dangerous. I figured if they wanted the tree to stay, they could at least let people see the risk. The tape lasted 3 days. I came home from work one afternoon to find the tape neatly cut and rolled up on my porch table, like a scold delivered in plastic. There was a new note tucked under it. It was not a formal citation this time, just a terse reminder printed on association letterhead. According to them, any unauthorized signage or barriers along the entrance road were inconsistent with the community aesthetic. They were more offended by a strip of safety tape than by a rotting trunk over a public sidewalk. The next step in their ritual was predictable. A couple of days later, an email went out to the whole neighborhood, framed as a cheerful update. Buried between reminders about trash cans and mailbox paint, there was one paragraph about recent concerns regarding entrance trees. It said that any questions about tree health should be directed to the association's contracted landscape vendor and that homeowners were not to make unauthorized assessments or modifications. It was a polite way of saying that my arborist's report did not count. The board arranged for their landscaper to come walk the entrance. I watched from my front window as he arrived in a logoed truck and stepped out with a tablet and a clipboard. The air was heavy and warm, and you could hear the muted hum of traffic from the main road beyond the gate. He walked partway around the tree, tapped the trunk half-heartedly with the side of his boot, and made a few notes. I stepped outside, staying on my side of the property line, and listened without interrupting. He talked mostly to the landscape chair, Ms. D, who had come out specifically for this. She gestured at the canopy line and the way the row of entrance trees framed the view of the bay. The landscaper nodded in the mechanical way of someone who knows who is signing the check. After a few minutes, he announced his verdict: the tree was stressed, but not an immediate hazard. He recommended monitoring it through the next season and possibly crown reduction to remove some of the heavier dead limbs. The word removal never crossed his lips. Later that week, the association sent me his written evaluation. It was 1 paragraph long. It acknowledged some decay at the base, but said that overall structure appears stable at this time. That last phrase, "at this time," was doing a lot of work for them. They attached his 1-paragraph evaluation to a formal denial of my request, doubling down on their earlier decision. According to them, because their own vendor had not declared the tree in imminent danger, they were unable to authorize removal, which may significantly disrupt the entrance streetscape. They even referenced the same section again, CCR Section 7.4 Streetscape Integrity. The irony was suffocating. They had an independent expert using clear terms like advanced structural compromise, and they had their contractor using vague phrases and short sentences. Guess which one counted? Conflict did not explode in one big event, it unfolded through a steady drip of pettiness. Neighbors started to notice the condition of the tree. Some gave me sympathetic looks when they walked past and saw the bare limbs. Others, the ones who spent more time at association events, gave me that tight, polite smile that said they already knew which side the narrative would land on if things went bad. The board never mentioned safety in their communications after that. They talked about consistency, visual harmony, and the canopy effect. They talked about how removing one tree would create a gapped appearance along the entrance road. It was always about what drivers saw for the 15 seconds between the gate and the traffic light, never about the people who actually lived beneath those branches. Every time the wind picked up, the trunk moved in a way that made my stomach tense. On calm days, you could almost forget, but on gusty evenings, the hollow creak of the wood carried along the street like a warning. A single cracked limb hung over the sidewalk, and I knew it was only a matter of time before gravity finished what rot had started. I had reached the end of asking nicely. What I had not realized yet was how far the board would go to prove that they, and only they, controlled what happened along that entrance road. The next envelope that mattered came in June, when the air felt sticky and the sky turned that pale, flat blue that means storm season is waking up. In my mailbox, between a grocery flyer and a utility bill, was a thick letter from the association marked Important, Enforcement Action. Inside was a notice of violation and intent to fine. According to their records, I had failed to maintain common area tree in a condition consistent with the entrance standard and had created an unsightly and hazardous situation by allowing deadwood to remain visible. That was rich, considering the deadwood was attached to the trunk they refused to let me remove. They claimed that my earlier cleanup of fallen limbs and the temporary hazard tape counted as unapproved modification. In their logic, that meant they could now treat the whole situation as my fault. They scheduled a hearing date and said that fines could begin accruing if I did not cure the violation by bringing the tree back into compliance with their standards. There was no way to do that. You cannot make a dead tree alive again by willing it to look green. At the bottom of the letter, in small type, was a line about possible escalation. If fines were not paid, they could apply them to my account, add late fees, and eventually pursue all remedies available under CCR Section 9.2, including but not limited to lien. The number they listed as the maximum they might seek if things continued was $5,000. That was the first time the amount showed up in writing. It was not a random threat the treasurer tossed out one day, it was a calculated ceiling, fines, administrative costs, and legal review all rolled together. It was their way of saying that protecting their entrance view was worth more than that to them. The math behind it was absurd. They were willing to spend, on paper, more than the cost of safely removing and replacing the tree just to preserve their authority to say no. If you ever wanted a textbook example of HOA fines gone wrong, this was it. The abuse of power was not subtle anymore. I sat at my kitchen table with the letter in front of me, the paper slightly curling at the edges from the humidity. Outside the window, a distant rumble of thunder rolled in from the direction of the water. It was one of those heavy afternoons when the air felt thick and the sky hung low. I realized something important in that moment. They had finally put in writing that they considered the tree my violation, even though their own vendor controlled what I could do with it. They had claimed I was responsible for both the appearance and the risk, while blocking the only responsible fix. That contradiction was not just unfair. It was a structural flaw in their whole position. They thought the threat of money would scare me into backing down. Instead, it gave me a clear target. I started a new folder that night. The first page was the notice of violation and intent to fine, with a bright sticky note marking the line where they tied me to the maintenance of an asset they would not let me change. Behind it, I placed copies of the original landscape maintenance citation dated March 3, 2024, the arborist's report calling the tree a high-priority removal, and the contractor's vague monitoring recommendation. Layer by layer, the file turned into a story the association did not realize it was writing. Escalation always feels like a surprise to the person on the receiving end, even when the other side has been building toward it the whole time. The hearing they scheduled was technically my chance to be heard, but the notice made it clear their assumption was that I would come, apologize for confusion, and agree to pay fines or accept a compliance plan that kept the tree standing. That was not going to happen. Before the hearing, a smaller envelope appeared. It was a final notice of violation dated July 10, 2024. This one said that because I had not resolved the issue to their satisfaction, the board had voted to impose daily fines backdated to a specific date in June. They also added an administrative fee for the landscaper's site visit, plus an extra charge for staff time preparing correspondence. At the bottom, in bold, they warned that failure to pay or address the underlying violation could result in the account being referred for collection. They were building their path toward that lien, one small addition at a time. What they did not expect was that I was building something too. A few days after that notice, a summer storm rolled in with the kind of sideways rain that leaves streaks on the windows. The wind pushed hard against the trees for a couple of hours before the system moved inland. When I walked outside after the rain tapered off, the sidewalk under the dead tree was littered with fresh wood. A long limb had cracked and fallen, luckily missing the path by a few feet and landing mostly in the grass. I took more video. This time, I walked around the fallen limb, showing where it had landed and where a person would have been if they had been walking by in that moment. I filmed the crack along the trunk, now wider, and the way the soil heaved slightly near the roots. I stayed calm, documenting rather than reacting. Then I called the city. Our city has a code enforcement office that handles things like dangerous structures. I reported a potential hazard tree over a public sidewalk on common area property and explained the situation without injecting emotion. I gave dates, described the board's denial, and mentioned the arborist's report. They said they would send an inspector. The inspector showed up the following week on a clear, sun-washed morning, clipboard in hand. He wore a reflective vest and walked with the slow, deliberate pace of someone used to looking for small details that matter later. The sound of cicadas buzzed in the background as he circled the base of the tree, tapping and probing. He did not care about streetscape integrity or canopy effect. His job was to decide if this thing was a risk to the public. His written finding, which arrived a few days later, was crisp and direct. He noted significant decay at the root flare, visible cracking, and past limb failures over sidewalk. He checked the box that labeled the tree a hazard tree adjacent to public pathway and recommended removal within a reasonable timeframe prior to peak storm season. That letter, stamped with the city's seal, went straight into my folder. I also started gathering storm history. On an official weather data site, I pulled up reports of wind gusts, rainfall totals, and named storms that had brushed our area in the past 3 years. I printed the pages that showed gusts over certain thresholds and circled the ones that matched dates when I had documented the tree moving or shedding limbs. In another section of the folder, I placed a copy of our governing documents, specifically the sections about common area maintenance and duty of care. CCR Section 4.3 Maintenance of Common Elements spelled out that the association was responsible for keeping common areas in a safe and usable condition. Another line, tucked under Notices, laid out what people in the industry call the mailbox rule. Notices are considered delivered when mailed, not when read. That mailbox rule would matter later, because it meant the board could not pretend they had not been warned once those letters were sent. By the time I finished, the folder contained Landscape Maintenance Citation dated March 3, 2024. My arborist's report labeling the tree a high priority removal. The contractor's vague monitoring note. The board's denial letters referencing CCR Section 7.4. Notice of violation and intent to fine. Final notice of violation dated July 10, 2024. The city inspector's hazard tree letter. Printouts of storm reports with relevant dates highlighted. Copies of CCR Section 4.3 Maintenance of Common Elements and the Mailbox Rule. Stacked together, they told a simple story. I had tried to fix a safety issue, the board had blocked me to preserve an image, and now they were trying to punish me financially for the situation they had created. By this point, the board had denied removal, blamed me for the dead tree's condition, and stacked fines toward a $5,000 threat, all while official reports labeled the trunk a hazard. I had quietly turned each petty letter and stormy afternoon into evidence that they cared more about their postcard entrance than the people walking under it. The real escalation still had one more twist. A few weeks after the final notice, when the heat seemed to press down from above and reflect back up from the pavement, the envelope I had been expecting finally showed up. It was thicker than the others, with a return address not just from the association but from the law firm that handled their collections. Inside was a pre-lien notice dated August 1, 2024. It laid out, line by line, the charges they claimed I owed, base fines, daily penalties, administrative fees, legal review, and projected collection costs. The total came to just under $5,000. If I did not pay or cure the violation, they warned, the association could move forward with recording a lien against my property. They did not mention the dead tree's risk. They did not mention the city inspector's letter, because they did not know about it yet. They did not mention that their own CCRs required them to maintain common areas safely. All they focused on was the number at the bottom and their right to hang it over my house. The paper smelled faintly of toner and dust when I set it down on the kitchen table. Outside, late sunlight washed the entrance road in a golden haze, and the dead tree cast a long, crooked shadow across the sidewalk. Most people panic when they see the word lien. That is what the board was counting on. I felt something else, clarity. They had finally overplayed their hand in a way that was easy to explain to anyone who did not already live inside their logic. They wanted to weaponize the documents. I was going to use those same documents as a mirror. From that moment on, I stopped arguing with them in real time. I did not fire off emotional emails. I did not show up at meetings to get talked over. I sent one short response to their attorney, acknowledging receipt of the pre-lien notice and requesting that all future communications about the matter be in writing. I also requested a formal internal hearing as allowed under our covenants. Then I went quiet. Quiet, but not inactive. I added the pre-lien notice to my folder, sliding it in behind the city inspector's letter so that anyone flipping through would see the contrast. One page described a hazard tree over a public path, the next described a financial threat aimed at the person who tried to address it. I printed the upcoming board meeting agenda when it was posted online. At the bottom of the second page was a tiny line, Executive Session, Enforcement Matter, Entrance Tree. I highlighted that line and placed a copy in the back of my folder. It would later matter that they had discussed this behind closed doors while still pretending it was a simple maintenance issue. I even took a quiet walk through the neighborhood to see how other entrance trees looked. Some had minor trimming, others had small dead branches, but none showed the level of decay mine did. I took discreet photos from the public sidewalk, not to shame my neighbors but to show that the association standards were flexible when it was convenient for them and rigid only when they wanted to prove a point. They were about to see what happens when a homeowner learns how to use their own rules against them. The binder I built started as self-defense and turned into something sharper. By the time the hearing date came around, it was no longer just a stack of paper, it was a map of every decision the board had made to protect its image at the expense of its own rules. I gave myself one last piece of leverage before we faced each other. On a windy Saturday a week before the hearing, the sky went that pale gray that makes the ocean look flat and metallic. The forecast was only 4 breezy conditions, nothing wild, but the gusts were enough to wake the dead tree back up. From my front window, I watched the trunk sway in that wrong way, the whole mass shifting instead of just the branches. Down the sidewalk, a pair of kids from 2 houses over rode their scooters toward the entrance, laughing in that loud, echoing way that carries down the street. They were not in direct danger at that moment, but they were moving right into the zone I had watched limbs fall into all year. I stepped outside with my phone, keeping a distance that felt safe and staying well off the path. I started recording as the wind shoved at the tree again. In the frame, you could see the sidewalk, the kids rolling past with plenty of space, and above them the trunk flexing like a tired muscle. The wood groaned and the soil near the roots lifted slightly with each swing. The video did not capture a near miss. It captured something subtler and, in some ways, worse, a clear view of how the path everyone used and the failing structure above it lined up perfectly. It showed the potential energy of that trunk long before any actual impact. When I watched the footage back later, I noticed how the sound of the wind and the distant rumble of traffic mixed with the gritty creak of the bark. That sound told the truth better than any email. That file went onto a small USB drive labeled with the date and time. I printed still frames showing the lien over the sidewalk and slipped them into sheet protectors in the binder, right behind the city inspector's hazard letter. Then I sent one more certified letter to the association's attorney. It was short and calm. I acknowledged the upcoming hearing, confirmed my intent to attend, and noted that I would be presenting documentation and video evidence showing the tree's condition and the risk to pedestrians. I attached a brief index listing the documents by title, arborist report, inspector letter, citation dates, CCR section 4.3 excerpts, and the pre-lien notice dated August 1, 2024. I also added one line that mattered more than it looked. I stated that the association had been placed on notice of the hazard under the mailbox rule when the city inspector's letter and my earlier submissions were delivered. After that, I did not argue with them again. The board wanted this to stay a one-on-one fight, me versus their authority. I was done accepting that framing. From now on, it was going to be their choices versus their own obligations. The hearing was held in the small clubhouse near the back of the neighborhood. Inside, the air conditioner hummed quietly, and the harsh fluorescent lights made the beige walls look even more tired. A faint smell of coffee and copy paper floated from the conference room, the kind of bland scent that clings to every meeting where something uncomfortable is about to happen. The table was set up with the board on one side and a single chair on the other. At the head sat the association's attorney, a man in a dark suit whose expression was more annoyed than hostile. To his left, the president, Mr. K, already had a thick stack of documents in front of him. The treasurer, Ms. L, had a legal pad and a calculator. The landscape chair, Ms. D, sat with her arms crossed, a folder of glossy photos of the entrance trees in front of her like a shield. I walked in carrying my binder and a small laptop loaded with the video clips. The room felt too bright, but I made myself move slowly, placing my materials on the table like this was just another business meeting. They started with procedure. The attorney read a summary of the violation: failure to maintain the entrance tree in a manner consistent with community standards, unauthorized modification of common area vegetation, ongoing non-compliance, and accumulated fines leading to the pre-lien notice. It was all very dry, like someone reading out a report about a broken piece of equipment. I waited until he finished and the president said the hearing was my opportunity to present my side. Instead of arguing, I opened the binder. On the inside cover, I had placed a timeline printed in large, clean font. March 3, 2024, Landscape Maintenance Citation. April, arborist report recommending high priority removal. May, association denial citing CCR section 7.4. June, notice of violation and intent to fine. July 10, 2024, final notice of violation. Late July, city inspector's hazard letter. August 1, 2024, pre-lien notice. I slid the binder across the table, open to that page. Then I placed the small USB drive on top of it. I explained, calmly, that everything I was about to describe was documented and indexed by page number. I pointed to each section, the arborist's findings, the city's hazard classification, the photos of cracked bark and lifted soil, the storm reports, the copies of our covenants about common area maintenance. Then I pointed to the pre-lien notice, folded neatly at the back of the stack like an exclamation mark. The attorney glanced at the timeline, then at the tabbed sections, and I saw his posture shift slightly. He was used to homeowners arriving with feelings and scattered emails. He was not expecting a story laid out as evidence. I asked them to start with the video. On my laptop screen, under the harsh lights, the footage played, the dead tree flexing in the wind, trunk bending in a way no healthy tree should, soil at the base lifting in damp, patchy mounds. In the background, the sound of the gusts and the creaking wood ran like a low warning. The second clip showed the kids on scooters entering the frame, the tree heaving above the path. Again, no near miss, no shock moment, just a clear illustration of what it means to have a decaying structure over a route real people use every day. The room fell quiet while the video looped. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner and the faint whir of the laptop fan. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone of wanting someone to get hurt. I simply pointed out the obvious. The association had been made aware, in writing, that a tree on its common area was structurally compromised. A certified arborist and a city inspector had both documented the risk. Instead of acting to remove the hazard, the board had chosen to deny my requests, block my attempts to mitigate, and then pursue fines and a lien against me for the condition of that tree. Then I opened the binder to CCR section 4.3, the maintenance section that said the association was responsible for keeping common elements in a safe condition. I placed a finger under the line and let them read it themselves. Next, I turned to the city inspector's letter and read just the classification line: hazard tree adjacent to public pathway, removal recommended prior to peak storm season. Behind it, I showed the post office receipt confirming when that letter had been mailed to the association's address and the tracking printout showing delivery. Under the mailbox rule in our own documents, that meant they were officially on notice the moment it hit their mailbox, whether they chose to open it that day or not. Finally, I flipped to the pre-lien notice dated August 1, 2024, and placed it side by side with the inspector's letter. One page documented a safety problem. The other page documented a financial weapon pointed at the person who tried to fix it. I asked them a question I already knew the answer to: if that tree fell tomorrow and injured someone, could the association honestly say it had done everything reasonable to remove a known hazard once it had documentation from both an arborist and the city? The attorney did not answer out loud, but he did press his lips together and tap his pen against the pre-lien notice. The board members shifted in their chairs. The landscape chair, who had spent years guarding the perfect canopy, looked at the photo of the cracked trunk and the video still of the soil lifting and seemed to understand, maybe for the first time, how bad it would look outside their bubble. I did not threaten lawsuits or talk about going to court. I did not need to. I had already taken the quiet step that mattered. I had sent the same binder, minus a few internal association documents, to the city's code enforcement office with a cover note explaining that the association had been made aware of the hazard and had so far chosen fines over remediation. Which meant that now, it wasn't just me watching what they did next. That was the moment the balance of power shifted. They had walked into the room believing this was a story about a difficult homeowner. They were walking out with the realization that this was now a story about a board that had been warned, documented, and recorded choosing aesthetics over safety. The outcome did not arrive as a dramatic announcement in that room. It came a few days later, in the form of 2 letters that hit my mailbox on the same afternoon. The air outside had cooled slightly after an early morning shower, and a light breeze carried the smell of wet grass from the entrance road. The first letter was from the association's attorney. It was labeled Resolution of Enforcement Matter. Inside, the tone was careful and polished. After further review, the board had decided to rescind all fines and fees related to the entrance tree matter. The pre-lien notice dated August 1, 2024, was hereby withdrawn, and the association's records would reflect the matter as closed, with no outstanding balance. They did not apologize. They did not admit wrongdoing. But in a single paragraph, they erased the $5,000 threat they had built so methodically. The second letter was from the board directly. It announced that, following consultation with city officials and independent evaluation, the association would be undertaking necessary maintenance to address the condition of a tree along the entrance road. There was no mention of my name, just a bland assurance that they were committed to the safety and aesthetics of the community. Attached was a notice from the city's code enforcement office. The association had been given 30 days to remove the hazard tree and document its replacement plan. Failure to comply could result in municipal penalties. They had spent months insisting the tree was part of a perfect postcard entrance that could not be altered. Now, under pressure from something larger than their own bylaws, they were under a countdown of their own. I pinned those letters inside the binder, opposite the old violation notices. It was satisfying to flip between them, from accusations and threats to careful, neutral language about resolution and necessary maintenance. The abuse of power had not vanished, but it had been pushed back inside the limits of their responsibilities. On removal day, the sky was a sharp, clear blue, and the air carried the salty edge of the bay. A work crew arrived early with cones, chainsaws, and a chipper. They roped off the sidewalk and entrance lane closest to the tree, something I had been told would disrupt the canopy experience when I suggested caution tape months earlier. I watched from my driveway as they worked. The saws buzzed, and chunks of brittle wood fell in controlled arcs onto the grass. From up close, you could see just how hollow the center of the trunk was. The wood crumbled in places instead of slicing cleanly. As the crew cut the tree down in sections, the carefully curated canopy the board had worshipped developed a gap. From the main road, drivers entering the neighborhood would now see an asymmetry, a missing tooth in the row of oaks. To the board, that gap was an eyesore. To me, it was evidence that safety had finally outranked vanity. They ground the stump and hauled away the debris. A few weeks later, a new sapling appeared in its place, staked and mulched. It was smaller, younger, and still flexible. For a while, the entrance looked uneven, one side taller than the other. The world kept spinning. Houses did not lose value. No one fled the neighborhood because of a bare patch of sky. What did change was the way people talked about the board. Word of the binder and the video spread in a quiet, steady way. I had not shared details widely, but neighbors talk, and small communities have long memories. At the next annual meeting, held in the same fluorescent-lit clubhouse, questions came from people who had never spoken up before. Someone asked why the association had pursued fines instead of calling a second arborist when a homeowner raised a safety concern. Someone else asked whether the board planned to update the covenants to clarify how hazard trees on common property would be handled in the future. The landscape chair looked less certain than usual. The president tried to keep the agenda moving, but the mood had shifted. Out of that meeting came a proposal for a new policy. If a certified arborist or relevant city department declared a common area tree a hazard, the association would prioritize removal and could not punish a homeowner for reporting or documenting the issue. The policy would require the board to seek a second opinion only from another certified expert, not just a vendor whose main job was routine maintenance. The policy passed, not because everyone suddenly loved me, but because enough people understood that power without accountability is a liability. The financial sting landed quietly months later, when the budget discussion revealed a small increase in the association's insurance costs. The board brushed it off as market conditions, but people who paid attention could guess that a near-miss hazard case, captured on video and documented in city records, had not made their insurer happy. They had tried to hang a $5,000 lien over my house to protect their entrance image. In the end, they were the ones answering quiet questions from an insurance rep about why they ignored 2 separate warnings before taking care of a rotting tree. That was the kind of satisfying revenge that did not need shouting. It just needed time. Life settled. The entrance road looked different in the late afternoon light, with a slightly wider patch of sky where the dead tree had once cast its twisted shadow. The new sapling flickered in the breeze but did not creak. Kids rode their scooters under it without me tensing up. Dog walkers passed by without glancing nervously overhead. Sometimes I still opened the binder and flipped through the pages, not to relive the stress, but to remind myself of what actually worked. It was not yelling in meetings or firing off angry messages. It was understanding where the association's power ended and its obligations began, then putting those boundaries in writing. This was never just about a tree. It was about a group of people who convinced themselves that the neighborhood existed to protect their idea of perfection, and a reminder that a community is more than a picture taken from a moving car. They wanted a photo-ready entrance. I wanted a safe sidewalk. In the end, safety won, and their perfect canopy will always have a story-sized gap in it that only they can feel every time they drive under the new sapling. The best part? The next time someone on that board tries to use fines to shut down a homeowner worried about a real hazard, there is a policy, a city file number, and a video of a rotting trunk bending over a sidewalk to remind them what happens when they forget the basics. I never got an apology. What I got was better, a safe street, a cancelled lien, a permanent record that they were forced to change because one homeowner refused to let their abuse of power hide behind a row of trees. Tell me your HOA horror in one line about perfect entrances hiding danger.